Pastor D. Roll.
All right. We're going to get into chapter 2 of Love Speech. If you haven't seen chapter 1 yet, you might want to go back and read that. A couple of things, or not read it. Well, you can read it. You can go online and get it. Or you can go back and watch the video that's probably sitting right next to this one where you can hear me reading it. One of the things I want to say before I start this is I use the term homosexual sexual activity a number of times in this book, and I'm just going to use the letters HSA so that I don't have to keep saying that over and over and over again, both for time's sake and just it's not necessary to say it over and over again. So when you hear me say HSA, that's what I'm talking about. Let's get into chapter 2 of Love Speech. The chapter is called The Burden of Proof. In any argument, one side must carry the burden of proof. I am an attorney, so for me this concept is particularly important. In a trial, it is very important that both sides know who has the burden of proof. The burden of proof can be described as the principle that one side must prove his argument is correct, while the other side must defend against the arguments of the side with the burden. In a criminal case, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. The prosecution must convince a jury that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That is to say, the jury must believe the evidence is so strong against the defendant that no reasonable doubts exist in their minds. In most civil cases, the plaintiff must prove his case by a preponderance of the evidence. So, stepping aside, criminal cases, beyond a reasonable doubt. In civil cases, a preponderance of the evidence. This means the plaintiff, this is civil cases again, this means the plaintiff must show that the evidence proves it is more likely than not that the defendant has wronged the plaintiff. You have probably seen the statue of the blind lady holding the scales. Imagine those scales tipping ever so slightly in favor of the plaintiff. If the defendant can keep those scales equal or tip them in her favor, then the defendant wins. Regarding the issue of HSA, the burden of proof is on the side arguing that HSA is morally right. The reason for this is that the moral argument for HSA is the new guy on the block. That is not to say that HSA has not existed for a long time. What I am suggesting is that the great majority of people who have existed on earth for all of recorded history, including the present, have believed that homosexual sex is immoral. I will specifically address historical arguments attempting to justify HSA later in this book, but for now, it is enough that the reader understands that HSA has been considered morally wrong by almost all people at all times and in all places. This fact does not necessarily prove that HSA is wrong. Large groups of people have been wrong about morality before. The fact that most people have always believed HSA is wrong is not proof that HSA is morally wrong. However, the fact that HSA has been almost universally considered immoral does mean something. It means that the person arguing to justify HSA is the prosecutor of the case, and the person arguing that HSA is wrong morally is the defendant. All I am attempting in this book is to show that the arguments commonly used to justify HSA are not convincing. I do not have to carry the burden of proof. Think of it like this. Those who believe that HSA is wrong are innocent until proven guilty. This is because HSA has existed throughout almost all of human history, and the great majority of those who have dealt with the issue have decided that the evidence shows HSA to be morally wrong. If a person wants to justify HSA at this moment in history, it is his burden to prove that the activity is morally right. In other words, those who want to claim that HSA is morally right must convince those of us who believe it is wrong. Please do not think I am saying more than I intend. There is nothing necessarily negative about having the burden of proof. Prosecutors take defendants to trial all the time with a very difficult burden of proof, and they win. Plaintiffs sue defendants all the time, and they win. Discovering who has the burden of proof is not important because it begins by showing who has the better argument, but because it gives a framework for deciding what is true when the argument is over. My intention is not to prosecute those who claim homosexual sexual activity is morally right, but to defend the idea that it is morally wrong. I'll take just a second to expand on that a little bit. All I'm saying, this entire chapter exists just to talk about the burden of proof. And the point that is being made here is just to set the framework for the argument. If a thing has been thought about, pondered, considered, and people who have made ethical judgments, moral judgments for thousands of years have thought about this thing, and without exception, except in very, very recent history, almost everyone, especially ethical thinkers, have considered it to be morally wrong. And if you look at the creation, people's bodies and so on, you can see that this is something that does not seem to naturally work. Then what all I'm saying is that the person who's coming and saying, no, this is a good thing or this is the right thing, they're just going to carry the burden of proof. In other words, those who think that homosexual sexual activity is morally wrong only need to defend that idea against the arguments that are coming to suggest that it's morally right. Now, this chapter, so we're clear, doesn't prove anything about what's right or wrong. The rest of this book is going to spend a lot of time working through these arguments. All it's doing is setting the stage, setting the framework for how we think through an issue like this. And so that's chapter 2 of Love Speech. I hope you'll catch us back for chapter 3.
Pastor D. Roll.